if you're ready, let me go ahead and introduce you today, and then I'll hand it over to you. Right?
Okay, good.
Well, good morning, good evening, and good day to all of you. Thank you for joining today's seminar. As you know, we are running a CIB presidential seminar series hosted here from Purdue University. And the theme for this semester is Distinguished Women Researchers in the Built Environment. And today it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker for today as Professor Chrisna Du Plessis. And let me give a brief introduction to her background, her distinguished background. So Chrisna Du Plessis is a professor, chair of the School of Built Environment and head of the Department of Architecture at University of Pretoria in South Africa. She holds a graduate and postgraduate degrees in architecture from the University of Pretoria and a PhD from the University of Salford. She also has an honorary doctorate from Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden. With more than 20 years experience in sustainable human development, human settlement development, both as practitioner and as a researcher at the CSIR, and since 2011 at the University of Pretoria, she focuses on developing the principles and guiding frameworks for the practices of sustainable construction and human settlement development in a body of work that span the fields of housing, construction industry performance, human urban settlement development, and infrastructure design. Professor Du Plessis led the priority theme Sustainable Construction of the International Council for Research and Innovation in Building and Construction, that's the CIB, for almost 2 decades, and served 2 terms on the CIB board, one as chair of the program committee, and she has further served as juror for the Lafarge Holcim Foundation Sustainable Building Competition, the European Solar Decathlon, and the Future Arc Sustainable Design Prize. Her current research concentrates on resilience and regenerative development, and she has published some of her work in award-winning book called Designing for Hope, Pathways to Regenerative Sustainability. Please welcome Professor Du Plessis. Chrisna, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. If you don't mind, I'm going to switch off my video while I am putting up the slides, just so I can deal with some bandwidth issues on this side. Okay, now let me just get the full slide view. There we are. And minimize that. And get it down the bottom where it's out of the way. And there we can go. And hopefully that at the top will disappear eventually. All these wonderful technologies of ours. So good morning and good afternoon. And for those of you who are east of Greenwich, a good evening. And it's a great honor to be invited to share my research journey with you as part of the CIB President Seminar Series that's hosted by Purdue University and Professor Mark Hashtag, who you now know is the current CIB President. Now, when I was asked to speak, the brief was very vague. Just talk about your research, they said, which is always a dangerous thing to say to a professor. So I thought about what would be of value to the students and young researchers who took time out of their busy day to listen to me. And of course, I think my field of research is very important. But I think what is of more value is to understand how a research career develops and consists of many layers and strands of thought that is woven together over time. And that the backbone of a good research career is a golden thread that is driven by passion and a clear understanding of one's own perspectives, your core values, and your contributions. And that it's okay to do work that nobody really understands until years later. I'm also an architect, and I think that architects tend to approach research a little differently and in ways that don't always fit into the strictures of the scientific method and the reduction of the world into siloed disciplines. In fact, the OECD's Frascati manual does not even recognize architecture as a scientific field, forcing us to decide whether we want to be categorized as other engineers, social scientists, or artists. The confusion is because architecture by its very nature is a transdisciplinary field of inquiry. It draws not only on many disciplines, but also on many knowledge systems to surface answers to real-life problems and their spatial resolution. Most often, these answers lie within a vision of what can be possible in this specific context at this specific time and place, revealing a potential alternate reality. Unlike art, I don't know why this is still up there, but unlike art, which can be a solitary creative endeavor, architecture is collaborative and co-creative, with the final vision emerging from many iterations and considering many points of information. To arrive at this vision of what is possible, architects integrate the three eyes of knowledge proposed by St. Bonaventure: the eye of flesh, by which we perceive the external world of space, time, and objects; the eye of reason, by which we attain a knowledge of philosophy, logic, and the mind itself; and the eye of contemplation, by which we rise to a knowledge of transcendent realities. Or in more simple terms, the hand, the head, and the heart. Good design, good architecture, good neighborhoods, and good societies rely on the coherent integration of these three aspects. And trained in this way of engaging with the world, it should then not be a surprise that I approach the generation of knowledge in the same way that I would approach the making of architecture. And this makes it difficult at times for more traditional scientists or researchers to understand the value and contribution of my work. I would therefore like to begin this lecture by explaining the kind of research that I do. Perhaps the simplest way of explaining it is to say that the phenomenon I study is the noosphere. And the noosphere refers to the sphere of human consciousness and communication that arises from the collective intelligence and interconnectedness of all beings. It gives rise to worldviews, values, culture, creative and scientific endeavors, and human technological innovation. I study the fluctuations and the patterns in the noosphere, define these patterns to make them visible and comprehensible to others, and then explore what these new ideas and understanding of the world would mean for how we engage with the world. There are millions of noosphere patterns arising at any time, from internet memes and trends in fashion and design to political movements and scientific discoveries. The patterns I look for, and which form the focus of my research, are those that help me to answer the questions that keep me awake at night. The work that built my reputation is mainly situated in the first two steps, that of identifying and defining a pattern so that others can apply it in the development of their own fields. And let me illustrate this with an example. Recently, a friend of mine sent me a screenshot from their LinkedIn account where my name is mentioned by the authors of an article in conjunction with several other thinkers on whose work they built. These include luminaries from fields as diverse as ecology, economy, political science, as well as founders of businesses who led the development of circular and authentic sustainable business models. So what am I, lapsed architect and the only one without my own Wikipedia page, doing in such august company in a business journal? And the answer lies in this little word, regenerative. For the past 2 decades, I've been working on making this emerging noospheric pattern visible as a coherent theory of development. And I was one of the first people to identify it as the next evolution of the sustainability discourse, to situate it within a particular worldview, to unpack how it changes the way we think about the problems of development, and to define what needs to change for the world to shift towards a regenerative model of being. And this is the story I would like to tell today. But like all stories, we need to begin at the beginning. Many researchers are driven by a passion for a particular subject that arises from an impetus in their personal life. It may be a childhood wonder about the forces that unite the universe. It may be the death of a loved one. It may be a tinkering parent. It may be a spiritual experience in an old-growth forest. For me, it was growing up in the disappearing grasslands of the Mpumalanga Highveld in South Africa and witnessing firsthand how the rolling grasslands were first plowed to death, the once fertile soil forced to keep producing by a noxious cocktail of petrochemical fertilizers and pesticides. and then ripped open to produce coal for the growing number of power stations. During the first 18 years of my life, I witnessed the building of 9 coal-fired power stations and the coal-to-oil petrochemical plant in Secunda. And I saw how the deep blue skies of the Highveld turned grey and yellow from smoke and sulfur, how the soil became more acidic and required more chemical intervention, how farming towns became mining towns or simply started dying, and how the people around me became sicker and sicker. Today, the Sasol Secunda plant is the world's largest single-point emitter of greenhouse gases, with emissions higher than those of 100 other countries. And the air pollution levels on the Highveld is responsible for thousands of deaths annually. So having personally experienced this plundering and unraveling of the earth, the questions that make me lie awake at night are beautifully captured by the poet Drew Dellinger. What did you do when you once knew? It's 3:23 in the morning and I'm awake because my great-great-grandchildren won't let me sleep. My great-great-grandchildren ask me in dreams, what did you do while the planet was plundered? What did you do when the earth was unraveling? This impulse to be accountable has led me to the field of sustainable development. And I've been studying the evolution of this concept for the past 30 years as multiple of agendas paid lip service to the idea of a sustainable world, while leading us closer to the collapse of the global social ecological system. As the internet meme of the moment says, we are in the midst of the longest, saddest, most excruciating and unsatisfying I told you so in the history of the world. All our agenda seems to be too little, too late. The global polycrisis, created by the interplays between global socio-political instability, increasing inequality, accelerating climate change, ecosystem loss, and the pervasive pollution by the residues of the second and the third industrial revolutions and the lifestyles they enable, is creating an unfamiliar and a largely unknowable world in which the citizens of our future will have to function. And it's not just an environmental issue. It's also creating a huge mental health crisis, especially amongst our youth, who sees little positive in the future that we are creating. Now, I'm not an activist, and while I share the frustrations of the millions of people around the world who march and wave and sign protests, I do not believe that that is my purpose. Rather, I try to bring about change by doing what researchers do. I ask questions. And the 3 main questions I've pursued my entire career is, how did we get to this place? How do we fix the world? And what would a better world look like? So why is it that even though we know things are getting worse and will be getting pretty bad soon, and that we know what needs to be done to avoid the worst of possible futures, the entire global society not only find excuses not to make the changes we know we should, but actively protest against them? And the answer is very simple. We won't act because the choices we must make fly in the face of everything we have been told we need to be and do. Not only to survive, but to be happy and successful. Therefore, our models of development are based on how we would like the world to work and not on how it actually works. We know our choices shape our world, but we rarely recognize that these choices are themselves shaped by our beliefs about the world. Albert Einstein famously said, we cannot solve a problem from the same consciousness that created it. You must learn to see the world anew. And the reason why we are in the situation we are in is because our beliefs about the world is shaped by our particular worldview. For the past 500 years or so, Western society has been dominated by a worldview that reduced the world to a set of discrete elements that can be separated, aggregated, and manipulated to serve human purposes. Most importantly, it is a worldview that created a psychological separation between humans and nature that allowed the development of a value system that placed humans above the rest of the community of life, leading to an economic model that ignored the limits of growth posed by the reality of a finite and an interconnected planet, and which now threatens vital planetary functions such as climate regulation. The reason all our agendas are not delivering on their promises is that they perpetuate this sense of separation and human superiority. In sustainability, this way of thinking led to the eco-modernist approach, which holds that humans should protect nature and improve human well-being by developing technologies that decouple human development from environmental impacts. And within this framework of thinking, sustainability evolved through various descriptive models that try to capture the complexity of human nature relationships and many approaches for measuring improvement of this relationship, the most recent being the net zero concept. But all of these are about doing a bad thing slightly better, as William McDonough said. The tendency of this reductionist worldview to break a complex system up into its component parts and the illusion that we can manage the performance of a complex system by setting measurable targets for individual components meant also that we can lose track of the original goal of sustainable development, which was to create a civilization in which we can meet basic human needs within the ecological limits of the planet. However, if we look at the SDGs, we see that looking after the planet, protecting and sustaining its life-giving systems for future generations is very much an afterthought. While this worldview has led to enormous advances in science and technology and created our modern cities with all their conveniences, it has also created a degenerating social ecological system in which our relationship with nature is exploitative and controlling, with nature seen as merely a resource to provide for human needs. This attitude sees us as isolated from our environment and focused on our own survival, in a world where we must compete for scarce resources in a system we cannot influence or change. And this leads to people becoming fearful and making decisions based on fear, which limits their imagination and willingness to listen to others and see other possibilities. It is becoming obvious that it is not technology or the economy or politics that presents us with the biggest challenge in creating a sustainable world, but escaping the trap of this mechanistic worldview. Fortunately, an alternative worldview is emerging, and this worldview has been labeled respectively as ecological, evolutionary, or living systems. I prefer to use the term ecological as it reminds us that we, as humans, are part of a much larger web of life. And drawing on emerging science fields as diverse as theoretical physics, ecology, and system science, as well as cosmology, philosophy, indigenous knowledge systems, and traditions of Eastern religion and spirituality. It presents a relational view of the world, with the patterns from the emerging sciences reinforcing the patterns found in ancient knowledge systems. The emergence of this worldview is one of the noospheric patterns I've been observing for the past 4 decades, and unpacking it and what it would mean for how we understand urban sustainability was the focus of my PhD. Understanding the ontology and the epistemology presented by this ecological worldview not only provides us with a theory of values, an understanding of what would be ethical and effective action, but also the scientific and social paradigms appropriate to this ontological position. And it provided a particular perspective that guided my research. The ecological worldview shifts our understanding of the world as being made up of separate elements to an understanding of the world as a system of interconnected and interdependent living systems that include humans and their socio-technical systems. Seeing humans as part of a family of life and being nurtured and supported by this family allows us to step out of fear and into love, not erotic or romantic love, but philia, the love that arises through affiliation. Essential to this worldview is the conviction that as part of living systems, humans can play a positive role in the development, regeneration, and evolution of the global social ecological system. We humans can be a force for good. We can create regenerating systems when we see our relationship with nature as one of collaboration, partnership, and co-evolution, in which we share the common goal of thriving, not just surviving. And by working with nature and following her values and rules, it is possible to create abundance by enabling the development and evolution of the potential within our systems. And this is the main promise of the ecological worldview, that living systems can be regenerated and that humans can play a positive role in this. So many of the narratives that we hear today are about how the world is ending, which is really kind of depressing. However, from an ecological worldview, an ending is just the beginning of a new cycle, we have a choice whether we want to focus on extending the life of a dying civilization or whether we want to focus on the birthing of a new civilization. If we understand how nature works in cycles of adaptive change, the systemic turmoil we are currently experiencing provides an opportunity for humankind to transform the world we live in and reshape it to create a future in which all species can thrive. And this brings me to my second question. How do we fix the world? The values and the ethics of the ecological worldview engages the heart and the emotions that drive our decision-making. It offers new ways of being. However, it also provides us with the tools to start fixing the wrongs in the world that our current modes of development are perpetuating. Fixing the world seems like an overwhelming task, but as Clarissa Pinkola Estes says, ours is not the task of fixing the entire world at once, but of stretching out to mend that part of the world that is within our reach. For me, that lies in proposing new ways of thinking that will hopefully lead to new ways of doing. I set out on a path to discover what lies beyond sustainability because it was already apparent at the beginning of the century that the mainstream sustainable development pathways were just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, and that the world is close to a branch point, both socially and environmentally. Our efforts at economic growth, still based on consumption, are proving to outstrip our efforts at resource efficiency and impact reduction. And while eco-efficiency may prolong the agony a bit, it is not enough to turn the Titanic, and we will eventually progress to systems collapse. I presented this first model of how sustainability can be moved beyond its paradigmatic limitations at a conference in Japan in 2005, proposing an evolutionary framework for sustainability thinking in which the next iteration of sustainable development would be what I called the cooperative regeneration model, because it focuses on having a net positive impact and thus regenerating the biophysical environment as well as society, and doing this through cooperation with nature and within communities. I did not see this model itself as the final model, but rather the transition phase towards the next more sustainable model of human development of ecological symbiosis, where humans live in symbiosis with their social and biophysical environment, so their whole ecological systems, with the one nurturing the other. This early model has since been developed into a more complex framework that takes the position that sustainability represents the neutral baseline where the positive and negative impacts of human activities cancel each other out, the so-called net zero goal. Above this line lies regenerative approaches that focus on making a net positive impact, while below the line are those approaches that focus on reducing the negative impact of our development activities. And this framework integrates the paradigms of sustainability, resilience, and regenerative development, the various approaches within each paradigm, and the goals they pursue, and situates these paradigms into larger philosophical frameworks of thinking, as well as the worldviews that underpin them. But what does this mean for changing the way that we do things? Working from an ecological worldview and a paradigm focused on growing positive impact, we need practices and environments that integrate natural and socio-technical systems, are eco-effective, working with nature to create an abundant world, regenerative, restoring and recreating natural and social environments, resilient and adaptive and dynamic, seeing the city as a collection of processes, not as a collection of objects. I unpacked this in two significant projects in collaboration with a number of colleagues and postgraduate students. And we wanted to know how we can use the perspective of an ecological worldview and theories of ecological resilience and regenerative development to address urban spatial resilience in a way that goes beyond disaster risk management. One of the main outputs was the development of this framework for resilient and regenerative cities, which offers a different way to think about urban planning and design and a mechanism to deal with change in rapidly urbanizing contexts. Instead of the usual list of indicators and checkboxes, we offer a toolkit of lenses that can be used to direct the development, design, and management of these three aspects, creating structure in a city. The second project was in collaboration with Dr. Dominique Hess, whom I first met at that conference in Tokyo, where I presented my idea for a regenerative paradigm. As we both moved into academia, I to the University of Pretoria and she to the University of Melbourne, we bonded over our concern about the high levels of anxiety and depression we were seeing in the younger generations passing through our classrooms. and the desperate need for an alternative, more hopeful narrative that presents a possible pathway out of all the doom and gloom. Taking inspiration from Raymond Williams, who said that to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. We set out to find the pathways that would make hope possible. This culminated in the production of the book Designing for Hope, Pathways to Regenerative Sustainability. And while I've been working on the theory of how an ecological worldview changes the way we engage with the built environment and what the emerging field of regenerative design would look like, with this book, we also wanted to provide examples of what is possible. To this end, we interviewed more than 50 practitioners around the world who identified as practitioners of regenerative design and development, or who did work we would consider regenerative. While we collected several case studies to illustrate particular aspects of regenerative design thinking, what was really interesting were the patterns that emerged about how regenerative design and development not only changes the process and the role of practitioners, not just the products of design, but also the practitioners themselves. And regenerative work requires a new kind of practitioner, someone who is self-aware, who can observe themselves and manage their state of being, and who is confident enough to be vulnerable in high-conflict environments, someone who can work creatively with ambiguity and uncertainty, which enables them to welcome the complexity of natural systems and the diversity of perspectives that characterizes living communities, and someone who is a servant leader, working regeneratively in service to all life. As a co-creative and a collaborative process, regenerative practice is an exercise in non-attachment, to not be attached to the preconceived ideas about the physical manifestation of a project or what is being developed, but to be able to look beyond these ideas to see what really should be developed. And this would mean the following for practitioners, is that they need to step back and listen to the site, listen to what the client really needs as opposed to what they think they want, listen to the stakeholders, which includes the environment. And from there starts to identify the potential for creating something that can add more value, that can heal, that has a net positive impact across scale. They need to let go of control, to not force the current or go against it, but to go with the flow and gently steer everyone along a path that emerges out of all the different flows of information and energy. They need to let go of preconceived ideas of what the ideal outcome should be and look like. And lastly, they need to focus on potential instead of on problems and what can be done to reveal that potential and allow it to grow. The new role of the practitioner then becomes that of a systems actualizer, awakening the capability and potential of the system within which they are working. And this requires that the practitioner serve as a matchmaker, a mediator, and a facilitator of the dialogue between various stakeholders, including the ecological systems of place, and help all stakeholders to see the true potential of what can be released and their role in creating a common vision so that they can care about the outcome of a project. Furthermore, working with complex living systems requires that there is a vision keeper who holds the big picture and has the capacity to shift between foreground and background, big picture and detail, and hold space for different viewpoints. And as regenerative practice is based on a worldview that may be unfamiliar to many stakeholders, including members of the professional team, part of the practitioner's role is to serve as a mentor that can introduce the stakeholder group to the ecological worldview, urging them into a new way of thinking about what is being developed and its ultimate purpose. With the concept of regenerative design and development becoming the latest buzzword, there are now numerous attempts to devise metrics and checklists for what constitutes a regenerative project. Such attempts still derive from a worldview that believes everything can be packaged and neatly subdivided in measurable categories and do not consider the realities of complex adaptive living systems. We therefore also need different ways to assess whether what we are doing is regenerative. And perhaps it is as simple as asking the following questions. Is it compatible with the health and well-being of the social ecological system? Is it creating value for its community and the community of life? Does it foster positive relationships? And this brings me to the praxis part of the lecture and my final question. How do we create a better world? An ecological worldview holds that a better world cannot be centered on human well-being only. So the question is, how do we create an abundant and a thriving future in which all species can flourish for all time? The first step towards creating such a world lies in accepting that we are part of nature, that humans are nature too, and that our socio-technological world forms part of a global social ecological system. And if we acknowledge that humans are part of nature, it follows that we should follow the laws of nature, cooperate with nature, and learn from nature. Janine Benyus, who's another noosphere surfer, who introduced the world to the concept of biomimicry, proposed a set of design principles derived from nature to keep in mind whether we are developing cities, designing buildings, or creating new materials and technologies. For me, the truly interesting practical question centered on how these design principles and our understanding of cities as social ecological systems can inform the design of better urban systems and help us develop the tools to improve decision making. And I would like to illustrate this with two examples. The first was a project I led while I was still at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, in which we investigated an industrial ecology approach to the problems of service delivery in small towns. One of the biggest service delivery challenges in South Africa is the collapse of our energy, water, and sanitation systems, which grow worse year on year. The objective of this project was to combine a range of nature-based technologies in an industrial ecological system to provide an integrated service solution that can improve municipal service delivery while creating local business opportunities, which will provide sustainable local jobs at different skills levels, and also address climate change mitigation and adaptation goals while we're busy with it. The goal of the project was then to turn municipal waste streams and sunshine into clean energy and clean water that can feed back into the town and in the process create additional local economic opportunity by turning waste into food, textiles, and jobs. The preliminary resource flow model showed that the project is technically feasible in terms of energy and water flows. And even the most conservative scenarios we ran, the financial model, showed profitability. Unfortunately, the project, like so many good prescient ideas, died at the feet of politics and bureaucracy, and some of the technologies were not yet at a sufficient level of maturity. But it is now 15 years later, and some versions of this system have been developed in other countries. So perhaps it is time to revisit this idea. The second example developed around the question of how we can make better decisions when it comes to the development and management of our cities and our neighborhoods. With most of the world's population now living in cities, the ability to make effective and informed decisions have never been more important. It has become abundantly clear that the standard siloed ways of urban management is not able to make the kind of decisions that are effective in responding to the wicked, intractable problems created by the complex, dynamic, adaptive, and living systems that are our cities. Now, this investigation started with a technology tree developed for the CSIR in 2005 to guide a research strategy for cities of the future. It was built on a theoretical foundation. It was drawn from my PhD, rooted in a scientific and a social paradigm that's based on whole systems, a relational approach, and that proposed the development of an urban dynamics laboratory that could support platforms for mapping, modeling, and simulating resource flows within cities to support a scientific basis from which to develop, test, and refine proposed development trajectories. A possible application, which is now cut off on the slide there, would be to develop logistical support for urban harvesting, which is capturing the local resource flows in a city with the intent of creating a closed-loop metabolism for cities. And this could include any resources from using waste as an energy source to efficient car share schemes. In 2005, the technology was not quite ready yet for the level of modeling and simulation required. Today, the original intention of the Urban Dynamics Laboratory is finally coming to life in the Hatfield Digital Twin City Initiative, which is managed by my erstwhile postdoctoral student and now colleague, Dr. Kalei David. And this year, we could harvest the first of the fruits from this technology tree, a digital twin for harvesting urban waste streams, developed in collaboration with the University of Twente. This level of fine-grained simulation would not have been possible without the Ukudorba method, developed in collaboration with the Chalmers University of Technology, for collecting and storing the kind of fine-grained geolocated data that's collected by citizen scientists and students in the spatial disciplines, using mobile devices to capture a range of data types to provide a nuanced understanding of place. So you can see how my personal experience and the sense of purpose it brought led me to a path where I developed a whole systems view of the world in which humans and nature are part of one social ecological system, in which humans can be a force for good and create an alternate future. This allowed me to develop different ways of thinking about the problems, processes, and principles of spatial design, and the role of built environment professionals in creating a regenerative and thriving world. And this intellectual understanding allowed me to explore real-life solutions using technology that learned from ecological principles to create better urban conditions. You can also see how I wove together many threads into one larger thread and would pick up dropped threads later again when conditions have changed. So what does the future hold? To quote Arundhati Roy, author and fellow architect, another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. Buckminster Fuller famously said that you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. Like the renderings created by generative AI, the model we are building is still a little strange and far from fully defined. But this alternate world is slowly starting to take shape in the noosphere. That future world of ecological symbiosis I got glimpses of decades ago is beginning to emerge as an alternative to the collapsing world created by the Anthropocene. Philosopher Glenn Albrecht named this new world the Symbiocene, in which human action, culture, and enterprise will be exemplified by those cumulative types of relationship and attributes nurtured by humans that enhance mutual interdependence and mutual benefit for all living beings, all species, and the health of all ecosystems. We're also rapidly shifting from the reality of the world as a social ecological system to a new reality of the world as a social digital ecological system. And what this will mean for how we develop cities and designing buildings and everything in between is an exciting new landscape to discover. This emerging new worldview also opened the door for a possible sixth industrial revolution that is rooted in human-nature collaboration and AI-assisted decision-making. Each industrial revolution came about because of new technology that was developed, which changed modes of production and opened new ways of living and working, which in turn changed the form, function, and flows of cities. If we look at the fourth industrial revolution, we see that increased digitization introduced by smart city approaches to monitor the flows and to manage assets and resources in cities and allow new ways of living and new ways of working. The emerging fifth industrial revolution, which is based on the notion of a deep multi-level cooperation between people and machines through artificial intelligence and ubiquitous computing, also see entire cities transformed into intelligent systems of sensors and real-time feedback loops that allow augmented humans to seamlessly interface with their environment. In the sixth industrial revolution, the technology driving change is none other than nature itself, allowing a shift towards an industrial model that's based on how nature works and which collaborates with nature. A judicious and a wise use of old and new technologies can help us to not just change and adapt, but to marry human ingenuity and the wisdom of Mother Nature. Seeing the city as an ecosystem allows us to introduce concepts of circularity in production and resource use, develop urban forms rooted in place, and find collaborative and co-creative ways to work and live that allow us to build local communities situated in place, as well as virtual communities of like-minded people from whom we can learn. The components of such a revolution are already rapidly emerging. Examples include constructing buildings by 3D printing a mix of discarded fibers, such as sawdust and offcuts from wood mills, and mixing this with lignin-based biosynthetic polymers to form a sustainable construction material. It is about bioreactive facades that generate renewable energy from algal biomass and solar thermal heat. It's about growing bricks using bacteria instead of baking them. And about biohybrid construction, in which humans, plants, and robots collaborate to build objects, even entire buildings, made of living biomass. These examples are only a small sample of what is happening, and I would like to spend the next few years tracking these developments in construction and other fields to develop a coherent description of the sixth industrial revolution and how it would change the world. One thing is clear: a regenerative future is transdisciplinary. However, there's a big difference between interdisciplinary research and transdisciplinary research. Transdisciplinary research is not what happens when a number of experts from different disciplines work together to solve a problem none of them can solve on their own. Crossing boundaries is not the same as transcending boundaries. And transdisciplinary research does not happen by putting people from different disciplines into a room and hoping magic will happen. Transdisciplinary research instead is both a way of being and a meta-discipline, based on pattern seeking that transcends and includes various disciplines and other knowledge systems to create coherent, holistic, higher order structures that offer the potential for system transformation. whether that be to develop new theories of knowledge or new configurations for social, technical, or economic systems. And this requires the ability to communicate in the many different languages of knowledge and the capacity to shift between foreground and background, big picture and detail, and hold space for different viewpoints. I've learned some very valuable lessons for transdisciplinary research. The first being that large, complex transdisciplinary projects require a clear common vision and conceptual underpinning, and that it is vitally important to allow time and opportunity for the various skill sets involved to learn a common language and understand interdependencies in the system. Secondly, addressing complex problems requires a systems approach, which needs a different way of planning and managing projects. Teams need to work closely together, not in separate work packages. And systems engineering from early on in the process is crucial. Third, as it is impossible to know in advance what the interdependencies in the system are, adaptive management is needed to deal with surprise. This means that replanning and redeploying funding to address emerging issues and require changes should not be considered a failure. And lastly, there are serious implications for funding models and performance management, which are currently not set up to deal with transdisciplinary research processes and outcomes. Transdisciplinary work takes a lot longer and therefore requires more funding, and the work done to create the higher order structure is often not visible. Unfortunately, in our current scientific and academic structures, the work of a transdisciplinary researcher is often seen as coordinating or a program management role, instead of the complex and creative process of higher order knowledge generation it is, which means that real transdisciplinary research is rarely recognized, let alone valued and rewarded. If academia is serious about supporting transdisciplinary research, it needs to address these shortcomings in its own metrics and evaluation processes before it can start developing transdisciplinary thinkers and regenerative practitioners. So to conclude, we are facing an unprecedented future. Our social ecological system is at a tipping point where it is already crossing from one stability regime to another radically different regime. It is the way of nature. If a system becomes dysfunctional, it will collapse so that it can be healed. We can no longer stop this boundary crossing, but we can embrace these changes as an opportunity to fix those things that were not working, that were harming the whole. If we continue to keep our terminally ill civilization on life support, we will miss our chance. We can focus on the problems around us, or we can focus on the potential for something radically new and better. If human civilization is to survive into the next century, we have to choose to be the midwives of a new world. And our best bet would be to start working with nature and let our actions be guided by asking, what would Mother Nature do? Our task is not a simple one, and it requires that we acknowledge the complexity of our situation. Sometimes it's simply not possible to summarize something into a 2-page executive summary. There are no easy recipes or 10-step plans, and most of our actions will require skillful negotiation of vast amounts of data and many competing knowledge claims. And this is a tall order for brains that have been rewired to think in sound bites and tweets. But now is not the time to be a lazy and unreflective thinker. Lastly, we can embrace the idea that our real purpose is pursuing and bringing about new orders of potential in ourselves, our families, our communities, our work, and our place, contributing to the ongoing regeneration and evolution of a beautiful, thriving, and nourishing world. To do this, we need to step out of fear and proceed with empathy and loving kindness. Looking at the world today, anger and fear seems to be driving us towards a major civilizational collapse, if not a significant extinction event. Never have we needed a global shift to care and compassion for all on this planet more than now. And I would like to end with a word to the students in the audience. You are my inspiration and what motivates me to keep going, even though it feels at times I feel like I'm fighting a losing battle. And I hope that you'll pick up these threads and that the work I'm doing in stitching together the components of a regenerative paradigm and a social, digital, ecological, industrial revolution will help you to weave a safety net to first catch civilization in its collapse and then transform this net into a scaffold for a radically different, life-affirming future in which all our descendants can thrive, not just survive. So thank you very much.
Krishna, that was very interesting, very fascinating seminar indeed. And I'm sure our audience are brimming with questions. I already see a hand going up. Katerina, if you please open your mic and do you have a question?
Hello. Thank you, Chrisna. That was a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it, and a lot of what you said resonated with my research and what I'm doing. I didn't have a question. I just wanted an applaud. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I cannot see everybody on my screen. So if you have a question, please either raise your hand so you get to the front of my screen, or else just open your mic. Well, while people are thinking, let me start with my questions. And I have a number of those. Indeed, you put things in perspective that we all should be thinking and really paying attention to what is happening because of bad practices, and what is it something that we all need to be thinking and doing. And so the question for you to address to the larger audience, perhaps takeaways, would be that you mentioned we need to the emerging science should learn from historical perspective. I think I captured that phrase from you. But in terms of three or four things that you would recommend practitioners do in their daily work, in whether they be architects, engineers, or designers, that how should they question themselves so that they're addressing at least some parts of what you have raised?
Ah, yes. How long do we have?
We have
There's
plenty of
either a
time.
very long answer or a very short answer. And but I think that it starts with yourself and with your own attitudes and your changing yourself, transforming the self. And that means that we need to do the things that we talk about, which is connecting to nature. And connecting to nature is not just going out and taking a walk every now and then somewhere in a wilderness area, but it is about our relationship with our immediate environment, with the insects and the birds and the animals and the plants that share our lives. It is about connecting viscerally, so really opening up our senses so that we become aware of how interconnected we really are with nature. It is about becoming involved in community, knowing that you are part of a community, whether that is your community where you are living, your community where you're working, a larger community, but that you start building that sense of sharing ideas, supporting each other, and finding ways of spreading love. I have a set of exercises that I give to my first year students to get them in the right frame of mind. And there's simple things that includes things such as just every day think about a simple act of kindness. Now, it may sound like a really silly thing to do. We're talking here about architects and engineers going off and designing buildings that we want to do that. But if your heart is not in the right place and your mind is not in the right place, then what you do at the end of the day is to just follow the easy route. So it becomes much more difficult when you get pushback from a client, from the funding people, to say these things are not important, is to have that fortitude to know that this is important, that we have to push back, that we have to bring in those agendas, and that we have to fight for them, and fight for them in a gentle way. So it doesn't have to be a confrontational way, but how do you engage with your team so that you also bring them into this space of thinking? So it is a psychological change as much as it is a change in how we practice. I think in terms of the day-to-day practices, we're starting to do a lot more work that's thinks about integrated design and development. Now, integrated design and development just tells us that we need to do things from the beginning. Things like BIM helps us to force this kind of thinking, because BIM works much better if the entire project team are involved right from the start. And we all agree on the principles and we agree on our values that we are taking forward into this project. So it's not just about people plugging in where their skills sit and they do some calculations or they do some drawings, but that it really is a co-creative process that we bring into being. let me stop there for a moment and see if there are other questions to do. As I said, we can talk for the whole evening.
Yeah, thanks, Krishna. I think Professor Ted Widener has a question. Ted, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. I appreciate it a great deal. One of the challenges that we have in the United States right now is a lack of housing, affordable housing, and yet following the pandemic, a lot of people are working from home rather than going into an office building. And so there is some effort to convert office buildings to residential spaces. And my question really lies along the line of, is that the right decision, or should we look at some other decision on using these office buildings, or maybe just demolishing them and returning the land to nature? And what would be a more sustainable approach from your perspective?
No, I don't think it helps to take the land to nature, because we still have to house people somewhere. And that means that we still need to build houses somewhere. So I think this whole movement of repurposing office buildings, of repurposing shopping centers, turning them into housing, turning them into community centers, is actually an excellent thing. Because part of the problems, I think, with American cities, it was particularly the cities that are so built around cars with the sprawling suburbia, is that it's very difficult to create communities in those cities. If we start putting people together into buildings such as office buildings, you actually create the possibility to create a community, not just in the building, but in that street, in that neighborhood. And you get people, you can bring in services and new ways of using space, new placemaking, simply because now you have people where before people would go in and they would disappear out there, and you maybe see them on the street over lunchtime. So it created a very unnatural way of living and working. So by having people being able to work from home, but still have a space where they can be in community, so they can go and sit and work in a coffee shop, they can go and sit and work in a co-working area, which is in their building or in the building next door to them. We are actually starting to regenerate the societies. And I think from my perspective, from where I'm sitting at the other end of the world, looking at what is happening in the American society, I think that there is a lot of disconnection and and fear and anger, because people are actually not exposed to each other as human beings, but just as ciphers of identity. And being forced to work with people, being in closer neighbors, you're working much closer proximity with your neighbors and with the people around you, forces you to start seeing them as people and not as other. I think that can be a very good thing for the social regeneration. There's also many different ways of bringing nature into those kind of developments, things such as looking at our food systems and looking at green facades, greening roofs, looking at changing streetscapes so that these become more public gardens, walk spaces, bicycle lanes, reducing the amount of car traffic, which you no longer need all these cars because people are actually living where they are working. It allows space to bring in biodiversity, to cool down the cities, to reduce carbon emissions. So I think in general, this is a really, really good way forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ted, for that question. Fernanda, your hand is up. So Fernanda Belisario, please go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Yes. So first, thank you, Krishna, for the amazing presentation. Lots of concepts to think about. What I wanted to ask is about, you mentioned a lot the connection with nature and how to move forward. And you also mentioned like the 6th industrial revolution. But if we look, I'm from Brazil, and we have the indigenous communities who have been living in connection with nature for centuries, but we are not used to look at them and the way they live as a valid thing. Like we don't take the lessons that they could give to us, and they are very well integrated with nature, and they build their houses with biomass. And their voices are often not heard at all in the mainstream. So I would like to know your opinion about how we could integrate the knowledge of these indigenous people into our toolbox for a more sustainable future.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent question. And it's one of the things that is emerging in this whole new way of looking at the world. Are those voices coming in to give direction? Because I think there are, in these indigenous communities, incredibly sophisticated ways of coexisting with nature. There's very sophisticated ways of making sure that everybody gets an equal share, that there's not a billionaire class and the rest of the people are slaves down at the bottom. So I think there's lots that we can learn in terms of how they structure their societies. Of course, I don't think that we actually all want to go and live in that kind of conditions, because we've become quite pampered in many ways. And I also don't think it is necessary. I think it is possible to take the lessons and see how do we bring them into our modern way of living. And I think we've got also this perception of industry as something that is destructive, that is messy, that is dirty. But if we start manufacturing processes the way that nature manufactures things, using sunlight, making things not in high pressure and high heat environments, but in life supporting environments and life friendly environments. There's a lot of lessons that we can learn from there that we can use to help us create a society. And I think there's already a lot of people, as the more and more I read about it, it's small little things happening here and there. But it's people coming to the problems of our industrial society, or coming to the problems of modern society, and saying, how can we use the way that nature does doing things? How can we learn from the way that people who have been living in such close relationship with nature and take it into our current environment and change and adapt so that we can make where we are better? So it's an ongoing process, but I think there's so much richness that sits in there. And I know that there's quite a few people who are looking at that. So not just in Latin America, Australia, North America, in South Africa itself, I've got quite a few colleagues who are now starting to really interrogate that. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next few years and how it informs the way that we do things.
Thank you, Fernanda. We have a couple of more questions. Let me go to the chat first, and then Peter, I'll come to you. We have from Oluwatobi. He says, as young engineers, what can we do to not lose our originality and creativity in our engineering practice in an age with increasing possibilities in AI, while still leveraging on it as a tool and aid?
I think that the AI bugbear sits there on everybody. People keep on saying, we thought that when we get robots that they would do the work and we can do all the creative stuff. And now it looks like we're back to doing all the carrying of water and hewing of wood, and we let AI do the creative stuff. I think it's part of the major transformation that we're seeing in this world at the moment. And the only way we can deal with it is to keep an open mind, to see how you can creatively engage with AI, to constantly question yourself. And you may run into bosses who are stuck in 1980, and that is fine. That is where they are. But there's nothing stopping you from doing things in a guerrilla way, just pushing the envelope, going further. But I think the biggest thing there is to maintain your level of curiosity by feeding yourself, keeping yourself up to date, whether that's watching videos, whether it is reading what people are writing, talking to your friends, setting up conversations that is not about how bad the world is, but about what we can do to make it better. But there's no one recipe. It's up to you to really be conscious about the need for you to grow your own creativity, to push boundaries, to challenge things, to understand that, yes, you're going to get pushbacks, and that is fine. To understand that sometimes your idea is 20 years ahead of the time. that is fine. You park it and then you wait for the times to get fertile. That's why I showed you this example of that technology tree that I did, which was very creative for that time. And people said, oh, this is fantastic, but we can't do any of it. And we don't really understand what this is all about. And now a lot of those ideas are actually starting to become mainstream research. So don't be despondent if you get that pushback. Just keep on doing that and keep on feeding yourself. Do the things that are not necessarily inside your discipline, but that may be other things that feed your creativity, that gives you joy. I think joy is the biggest source of creativity. So look for that and look for how that can do it so that you can keep that creativity going.
Thank you, Oluwatobi. Let me move over to Peter Paul.
Yeah, thank you, first of all, for the inspiring lecture. It was really very fascinating to see how your thinking evolves and over time. And the question I have, you mentioned at a certain point sustainable development goals. And I think that the sustainable development goals have been and are still a very powerful means in communication that we have, and also being part of a system that is installed by the United Nations as also a worldwide impact. So what I was wondering is, could we develop some kind of a new system of development goals that could incorporate these regenerative design principles that you advocate for? And that would then be, let's say, starting from 2030 till 2050, be the new paradigm to work on as a whole world. Do you think that is feasible?
I think it would be fantastic to do. But we will also have to redefine how we do this and how we measure these goals, because the moment we talk about goals, we look at targets. And the thing with this kind of thinking is that sometimes it's your measurement can only be seen in 20 or 30 years' time. Sometimes it's not a quantitative measure, it is a qualitative measure. So it's those kind of questions. And I think that's one of the things that makes it really difficult and why we are stuck with things like the Sustainable Development Goals, because they are easy for people to understand. They can be politically negotiated, so people can fight about the level of the goal. Are we going to save so many hectares of forest or so many hectares of forest? They make life simple because they focus on sort of simple one button solutions, if you want to put it like that. And it allows for various agendas to go in and be part of, get their agenda point on it. It will mean that we have to think very differently about how we structure these kind of negotiations. That it's not about getting everybody's agenda on the table, but about finding the common values. And I think that there was actually many years ago, I don't know if you remember the Earth Charter.
Yeah.
Was a kind of process that did exactly that. And what it said is that the goals and targets and things like that is one thing. They're politically sorted. They can be sources of as much corruption as they can be of good. But we need to have a common value system. And that common value system, if everybody follows that, then it would lead to certain outcomes. And that's what they did with the Earth Charter. And it was quite a comprehensive process. And it included not the politicians, but it included philosophers, artists, people, faith-based organizations, to come up with what I still think is actually quite a very good document that is a shared common value system that we can take to develop a better world. Unfortunately, that sort of got sidelined because once again, it cannot be measured. You cannot put money to it. It's not. It's got none of these things that are at the root of our very problem. All these things and I think that's what people don't understand is this whole impulse of us to put together goals and targets that can be measured, that can be sorted out. All of that is still mechanistic world thinking. It is not how nature works. Nature is about trying something. Oh yes, it's not working, and being able to very quickly adapt to that, very quickly change things. Our systems are not set up to do that. So I think it would be possible. I think it would be a great thing to do. Whether we are as a society at the level of maturity that would allow us to do that, that becomes another matter.
Thank you, Peter Paul. Any other questions? Please raise your hand so you get on the front of my screen and I know that you have a question. But while you're thinking about that, Chrisna, let me ask my next question that I had. Is you mentioned that regenerating systems is important, and you went into quite a bit of detail in discussing that part. And the question that was coming to my mind was that while I completely agree with your thoughts, that we have increasing amount of we have a large amount of existing built environment, and then we are thinking of new developments and new facilities. So how do you see the difference in regenerating systems when it relates to old existing stock versus new stock?
Well, that's the essence of regeneration, isn't it? It is to bring forth new life and to make things better than what they were before. So we're sitting with a lot of existing stock, and I think a lot of it is at the end of life, or it is built with materials that are harmful. And some of those things we need to figure out how we're going to deal with the waste. It is going to create waste. Some of the buildings we can see, well, is this going to become an urban mine? For example, I was talking about this urban harvesting process. Pretoria has one big skyscraper. It's the Reserve Bank building, and it's clad in glass. It was built 40 years ago, and they've now decided it's time to replace the glass with something that is a bit more energy efficient. So we get the score. We've got 14,000 square meters of tempered glass. What can we do with it? And it was a few calls, and we've been able to allocate this glass to a number of NGOs that work with informal settlements, that work with building community clinics, that work with creches, and we're distributing this glass into that. So it's taking a waste product and repurposing it, reusing it, putting it into a sector of society that would not have been able to afford that level of glass. So it's not the energy efficient glass that you would need for a glass skyscraper, but it's a much higher quality of glass than people currently would have in their windows. So it becomes about what do we maintain? And we were talking about office buildings, repurposing them. So what do we keep? Do we keep just the structure? We look at what we can do with the facades. How do we repurpose? How do we recycle? How do we... And I think it's also that shift of starting to see our existing building stock as a mine. So it's not a waste, but it is a mine that we can go to mine to extract the materials. If you live in a country like South Africa, you know how very quickly an entire building is literally carried away, and all that's left is the foundation as people reuse every little bit of that material. So you might not have that situation in the United States, but the principles are the same. Is to see that this is not a white elephant. What can we keep? What can we repurpose? What can we recycle before we send anything off? I think a lot of our buildings, we will probably have better cities if we can get rid of some buildings, if we can redesign them so that they start having better interfaces with the street, so that we can have better neighborhoods. So it's not a one size fits all answer. It is what can I do in this place that will add value, not just to the person, the building owner, or the people who are going to use the building, but to that broader community within which the building sits.
I think that is a complex problem in itself, and you mentioned that quite nicely, and you mentioned scale, time, and context, and so clearly the context is clear, and the time clearly is now, but the scale is global. You know, I think my question there would be, you know, how would you, given the disparity in different parts of the world, uh, how would you suggest, you know, countries approach that? And I'm putting it at a global scale. Uh, any thoughts on that?
Oh, goodness. If I can answer that one, they must make me president of the universe. I do think what we're seeing is greater inequality, not just between countries, but within countries as well. And I think in many countries, we see what I call the great undeveloping. It's countries that were developed, but now the infrastructure is starting to fall apart. The social structures is falling apart. Education levels are going down. Life expectancy levels are going down. But at the same time, you have this very high level of people who sort of hog up all the resources. You know, the dragons are sitting there hoarding their gold and not sharing it with everybody. I don't think that we as built environment professionals can do something about that necessarily. But I do think that we can, as voters, as members of the public, we can do things. We can practice social censure. If people start showing off too much of their money, we can vote people in who would look at tax regimes so that we can have a more equitable distribution of money. But it's very difficult things, and sometimes I think that we have to wait for the whole system to collapse and then we can restart again.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, it's a difficult question. Yes, it's a difficult question to answer. But I see that Don Ward has. Don, please go ahead.
Hi, Chrisna. Great to see you again.
Hi, Don.
As others, I echo the comments about an outstanding lecture. So thank you very much indeed. I'm very pleased we've recorded that session, actually, and CIB will have the opportunity to make it more widely available, encourage many, many others, students, ECRs, and senior people in the industry as well, to watch the recording and benefit from your provocations. But I suppose my question relates to one of your own 3 questions, really. How do we fix it? You know, and it's probably another big one about boiling the ocean, as Marx was. We're not short of research expertise and ideas in our sector, but we are short of take-up in practice in the industry or by governments. And so the topic of sustainable development is surely the ultimate example of that sort of problem. There's no bigger challenge for people in our industry. So I just wondered if you have any further thoughts on how we improve that relationship between research and practice to make a difference.
I think it's an education, and people tend to think that education stops once you've got your degree, and forget that education is a lifelong learning thing. And most professions now require continued professional development. So I think that what we need to do is we actually need to start educating the profession. We need to transform the people in the profession. I've actually just submitted a proposal with a couple of colleagues in various universities in Europe and in Turkey to do research exactly on how do we create this transformative curricula for our universities as well as then for the professions, so that we can get people to really change who they are, so that they can change how they see the world, and hopefully that will then start changing how they act in the world. And because otherwise I have no idea how to do it anymore. And that's one of the reasons why I left the research industry and moved to the university, because I thought at least I will have the bright minds of the future, and hopefully somewhere some seeds will be planted. And in a few years' time, these are the trees that will start growing and providing the fruit that will change things. So it's a long game. I don't know if we have the time yet for that long game, but
well, you're more than playing your part, I might say. And I'm very delighted that you did make that switch and are able to influence so many more young people. And I'm sure you will be an inspiration and achieve many of those aspirations. Thank you.
Yes, indeed, Don. Very well stated. Thank you, Don, for that question. We are exceeding our time, but I have two pressing questions that I want to ask Krishna, and before we wrap it up. And if somebody else has a pressing question, we might be able to squeeze that in as well. But my first question was, towards the end of your presentation, you mentioned about transdisciplinarity and the impact of that. And my question would be that, you particularly touched upon systems engineering. Many of our programs do cover systems engineering, but what would be your thought on the changes that we need to see in our in the courses and the curriculum that we have to bring in some of these ideas that become mainstream for the next generation as we go through that?
Yes, it goes towards starting to get people to see themselves as part of a whole and not as individuals. We talk about systems engineering, and systems engineers can get stuck in systems dynamics. And I think it's also to get that feeling of that this is an ecological system, and ecological systems operate very differently from how engineers tend to see them. So it is understanding that everything is connected to everything else, and that what you do here might change things there. It is understanding that all of this is driven by how we perceive the world, by the particular value systems that we bring in, and how that then shapes and responds back, and that you get feedback in a system. So a system is not a linear process, it's an iterative process as the system responds to feedback it gets from what happens around it. Now, part of this can be taught in lectures. Part of it, I think, it is necessarily to introduce experiential learning into our curricula. And I know that the engineering councils are looking at how can they start doing that. I know that I speak to the engineers in my university quite a lot about their ways of incorporating transformative learning processes, bringing in things such as reflective learning. And so it's more about the processes of learning and having that guide us to see ourselves as part of a system than it is about a fixed curriculum with a canon of information and knowledge that we need to put on the table. I think it's important for people to be able to make the calculations and to come up with new technologies and to be able to work across disciplines so that engineers can work with people who are ecologists, and we see this a lot in biomechanical engineering. We see this now in the links between neurology, the study of brains, and how we start designing all kinds of tools that could interfere with our brainwaves or create our brainwaves or repattern the way that our neural networks work. So I think we're starting to see it at that level, and I think it's possible to expand that to larger ecosystems and into nature. But it means that we need to work cross-disciplinary, and in that, it's often there's people who have the particular skill set to solve this particular little problem, but you do need also to develop the skills for people. And I don't think it's necessarily that everybody needs to do it. And I think it's a tricky skill set, but to be the people who are the glue, who come up with the ideas, who see the potential in these connections, and are able to keep that vision and keep that vision going, so that all these other people have a place to connect in.
Yeah, thanks.
And that
Krishna.
is a skill set of its own.
Yes, indeed. And I think Leticia Cook captures it very well when she says, you're planting seeds not only for the young, but also for all different ages. So indeed, that's true. Let me finish by asking my last question, as I always do, which is that, you mentioned briefly about your book, Designing for Hope, Pathways to Regenerative Sustainability. What can a reader expect in that book? All the answers, perhaps.
all the answers, of course, all the answers. Now, the book is actually quite an interesting sort of combination of looking at aspects of what kind of regenerative technology. So what do we mean? So it has an introduction to the ecological worldview. It then looks at various practices that people can use as tools to help with a regenerative project. It's permaculture, biophilia, net positive design. It looks at tools such as the Living Building Challenge. So it's a whole set of tools that come together. And then at the end, there's a set of chapters around, but what does this mean for me as a practitioner? So how do I have to change? How does it change the way that I practice? How does it, what are the kind of things that I can do in my day-to-day life that will help me to adopt this particular mindset? So it's a little bit of everything, and it addresses the whole person.
I think that should be a very interesting read for sure. So with that said, Chrisna, thank you very much. That has indeed been a very informative and very thought-provoking seminar. As you can see from the number of questions that were raised, that we have seriously exceeded our allocated time, but all for the good. And I want to thank you for that. And I want to thank all the audience for staying with us till the very end. And so please open your mics and give President Du Plessis a big round of applause.
Yeah, right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
for
giving me this opportunity.
Thank you in the audience for participating, and I look forward to seeing you all next week when we have another distinguished seminar already organized. So with that said, thank you all. I'll see you all next Friday.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.